Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today in spirit, if not in person. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope that this presentation gives you something to think about as you enjoy your conference. During this session, I'm going to try and do a number of things. I'm going to think about, first of all, this term inclusion and how it's gained international currency, how it seems to be something that is discussed throughout the world. And having done that, I'm going to consider how much we can learn from each other. I'm going to suggest to you that international collaboration is very important, and that through our partnerships internationally, we can share what we've learned and help our own situations to develop more effectively towards creating a more inclusive education system. But alongside that, I'm also going to argue that we cannot rely entirely on learning from other contexts, that our local context is important, and the successful development of inclusion has to be founded upon the reality of the situation in which we all work. We often hear today this term, education for all. It's a very broad terminology that we hear in a lot of documentation. We hear it when people are lecturing about inclusion. And I sometimes think we're a bit blasé in the way we use it. It's a term that's been around for a long, long time. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stated, for instance, that everybody has a right to education. But there are words here that I think we need to consider. What does the term right actually mean? And that has been determined in different countries in different ways. We all have human rights, but the way that that is implemented varies from country to country. So, for instance, the situation in my country varies a lot from where you are in India today, certainly varies a lot from, let's say, China or from North Korea, where rights are looked at in a very different manner. So, though the concept of rights has a universal interpretation, we have to recognise that in our own countries, we need to start by understanding what rights are in our own context. I think we could also debate what we mean by education, but that's perhaps for another day. Education is a very broad concept. Education for what? Education in an academic term, education for life. All of these things are things which perhaps need a bit more consideration than they've often received. Similarly, I think the notion of inclusion has been misinterpreted in many ways. It's easier to say perhaps what inclusion is not. It's not just an educational issue, and it's not only the responsibility of schools. We can educate people, but unless they're given opportunities, then they're not actually included in the society which we've created. It's certainly not simply about putting all children into mainstream classrooms. Mainstreaming has been a popular concept in some countries, but actually it's about finding the right location for children so that they can learn effectively. And that means learning both academically and socially. And inclusion is definitely not an issue which is solely about special educational needs or disabilities. Whilst there's been much in the literature which has discussed the education of such children and has used inclusion as a means for suggesting what their rights to education may be, it's a much broader concept than that. Inclusion International, an organisation run by people who have themselves been marginalised in many ways, refers to inclusion as the opportunity for all persons to participate fully in all the educational, employment, consumer, recreational, community and domestic activities that typify everyday society. And again, that may differ in your society from mine. So we need to be cautious when we're looking at this term inclusion to understand exactly how we're using the language. UNESCO have provided some useful guidelines on ensuring access for all. And I think there are some terms within this statement which we need to emphasize. They describe a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners, a recognition of individuality, if you like. And that's through inclusive practices in learning, cultures, and communities. Again, three important terms. We can put any child into a school, that's no guarantee that they will learn. If we take a child out of their culture, what does that mean in terms of the education we try to provide? And if we don't involve a full community in that education process, we're destined to fail. As UNESCO says, this process involves changes and modifications in content, approaches, structures, and strategies, terms that educators use all of the time. But it also requires a common vision which covers all children of an appropriate age range and a conviction that it's the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. No child left behind is another idea that has been expressed often, and it's the responsibility of all of us to make sure that an education that is appropriate, equitable, and accessible is provided for all learners. So this term inclusion, we know that inclusion is the opposite of exclusion. Nobody likes to be excluded. As I say, in many places, we've taken this term inclusion and we've considered it very narrowly. We've considered it, for instance, through disability. But in many countries, and in fact, I would suggest in most countries, we still have individuals who are excluded for reasons other than disability. For instance, for their race. In my own country, racial prejudice still exists, and expectations of people from some races is much lower than from others. There are still issues of caste, even in countries like India, where supposedly the caste system has been abolished. There are certainly issues of class. Class often brings with it opportunities for some and denies opportunity to others. Gender. In some countries, it's still true to say that boys are given far greater priority than girls when it comes to education. Sexuality. The denial of the rights of those from the LGBT community, for instance, still is a major issue in many countries. And often these things are closely related to poverty. Poverty is one of the major factors in excluding children from education. Poverty is pervasive. It requires often that children go to work too early, that they're withdrawn from education, that they become carers for others who are less fortunate in their own society, and that they often don't have the energy to learn because of poor diet. They're more subject to ill health and therefore likely to miss out on schooling. Poverty exists in all our countries. Obviously, in some, it is far more extreme than in others. But these factors all need to be considered in terms of the development of inclusive education. So let us think about learning internationally. Lots of advances have been made in our understanding of how we might promote greater inclusion. All around the world, people have been trying to tackle this issue. We've had international agreements going back, for instance, to the Salamanca Agreement. We've had national agreements. In India, for instance, the Right to Free and Compulsory Education Act, and more recently, the National Education Policy, have actually made statements from which we can all learn, including those of us in the West who have much to learn from what is happening there in India and elsewhere in Asia. We can learn from each other, and it's important that we do. So, for instance, we can see that there are many studies from countries like the USA, Canada, Australia, for instance, which, when we look at these studies, if we do an analysis, and there's plenty of literature indicating this, we can understand that there are certain factors that have been critical in enabling children to gain access to education. So I've listed some of them here, and any of you who are interested in reviewing the literature will find these from many, many different countries and administrations. We know that, for instance, if we're going to be successful in including children in education, we need to focus the training of new teachers to ensure that they understand the issues that are being faced. We need, for instance, to look at our existing workforce, teachers who've maybe been in the profession for many years, but who have limited experience and have previously had little expectation that they should address the needs of a wider population. They also need further professional development. These are not things that can be hurried. Training a teacher in many countries takes several years, and therefore we're not going to actually have a fully trained workforce immediately. It's going to take years for newly qualified teachers who have this training to come into the system and work their way through and have influence. We know from the literature internationally that greater consultation with parents or carers is essential if they're going to understand what we're trying to achieve, and we have a greater understanding and appreciation of the challenges that they face, then we're more likely to make progress. But also we need to listen to the voices of people from marginalised groups. There have been too many well-intentioned approaches to providing education for children and families without really understanding what their feelings are on this. I've always found it beneficial to work with people and to listen to their voices, and you will find if you look at some of my work, much of it has been about including people through listening to their voices and encouraging them to express their ideas. That's included work, for instance, in Telangana there in India, listening to the voices of people in rural communities who feel that they've been largely excluded from the educational development which has been more prevalent in the metropolitan cities. We also know from the literature that specialist resourcing of schools is important. We can't simply, for instance, put a child with a physical disability in any environment. We need to change that environment. We change the environment rather than changing the child. This is important. The deaf child needs to have good audio support within school. The blind child needs to have good tactile experiences within school. And we also need to have consistent links between teachers, other professional agencies, and employers. What are you educating children for? In some instances, we found that schools have been very successful at inclusion, but when it comes to leaving schools, those young people have been failed because employers and the workplace is not as well developed as schools and able to provide the education that is required. So the necessary conditions are known, but we need to consider the implication of those exclusionary factors that I mentioned a few slides ago. Poverty, caste, class, for instance, because these inevitably impact upon the pace at which change may be implemented. We can't expect education to change overnight, and that has to be determined by identifying those priorities which we feel we can deal with to create the foundations for further change. And these priorities are usually established by national governments, as for instance in your national education policy. And once we've done that, we need models to be adopted to promote change. And again, we can't simply pick those up from other countries and expect them to work in situ. We need to develop for ourselves. I'll just give you one example of a country that has done this very effectively. This is the Republic of Ireland, the southern 3/4 of Ireland. Project Iris was a 4-year longitudinal study, which I was fortunate to lead with my colleague, Professor Michael Shevlin. And it looked at the development and provision of children with disabilities initially, right across the country. And as a result of this 4-year longitudinal study, in which we visited many schools, we interviewed parents, teachers, other professionals, and young people, and gathered a lot of both quantitative and qualitative data, we were able to determine a number of things which we think could be applied in any context. And this, incidentally, is the cover of the report, which is available online, and the references at the end of the presentation. This is the model that we developed as a result of this research. And what we're suggesting is that in any country, there are 4 particular cells that need to be looked at, those being policy, provision, experience, and outcomes. And within each of those, if you look at the circles in the middle, the circle in the middle, provision will include things like access, resources, services. And then if we're looking at the outcomes we want, we need to look at pupil attainment and social interaction. In experience, we need to look at what we're delivering in terms of both the curriculum and the quality of teaching. And then policy has to be taken from national level to school policy if inclusion is really going to be delivered. Now, we believe this model can be applied anywhere, but it requires consultation and collecting of data from everybody listed in the oblong boxes at the side there. We need to understand the perspective of pupils, teachers, support staff, SNAs mean support staff, school principals, parents, other professionals, and we need to do that through observing what's happening in the classrooms and conducting face-to-face interviews with these people to get their perspectives. In that way, we can start to identify priorities and promote change. Unless we have this valid data, then we are not going to be effective in trying to change schools. So some of the critical questions that need to be asked, I would say, no matter what country we're working in, are things like, what are the policies in place that promote inclusion? Now, in many countries, we can say, oh, yes, there's lots of policy. In my own country, there are many, many policies to do with gender, to do with race, to do with disability. But the critical question is, are these effective? Are they being implemented? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Let's forget the policy statements and actually see what the policy actions are. What are the experiences of children, parents, teachers, and other professionals in the existing system? How are those experiences benefiting children, and how are they holding education back? How effective is the current provision at all levels, from preschool to adulthood? Many people have said inclusion is quite easy with the younger children and becomes harder as they get older. Why is that? Let's interrogate that situation and find out what the provision deficits are so that we can start to effect change. And how are the outcomes, both academic and social? And I would suggest that they are equally important for individuals from marginalised groups, whether that be from groups with disabilities, those from tribal backgrounds, for instance, and how is the data we're collecting used to inform development? The relationship between research and development is one that needs perpetual visiting and redevelopment as we work. So I said that I think it's quite important we look at culture. Edward Said, one of the finest writers on culture, is sadly no longer with us, um, actually recognised that, as he says here, it is important to ensure that we preserve all that is unique about a culture, so long as we also preserve some sense of the human community. So it is this linking what is precious to us in our countries and in our cultures. What is it that is unique, for instance, about India and important about its culture that we need to retain? But how does that sit within the wider international community? So India is finding its own way to inclusion, and it's important that it does so. It's important that my colleagues in India there learn from what has happened internationally. But this is about learning internationally and acting locally. It's about taking action to build upon the current strengths and to challenge shortcomings that are restricting education within the country. I've been fortunate to work in India for 25 years on a regular basis, and I have seen a great deal of movement and development during that period. But just as in my own country and in other countries in Europe with which I'm familiar, there is much that remains to be done. But it's important that actions that are taken are commensurate with a specific national situation. So I'm going to leave you now and say I hope you have a good conference. There are references there. Please do feel free to contact me if there's anything that I've said today that you wish to challenge or discuss in any way that I can help you. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.